Paul George and Russell Westbrook are back to being teammates and are once again looking for their first NBA championships and their franchise's first championship. But what if I told you the duo was nearly traded to the Toronto Raptors once upon a time? Let's take you all the way back to 2019, specifically the summer of 2019. The Toronto Raptors were coming off of the first NBA championship in franchise history, led by Kawhi Leonard, who eventually won Finals MVP in this series where the Raptors took down the Golden State Warriors in 6 games. Raptors fans, Toronto fans, we were on top of the world, celebrating hitting the pinnacle of North American sports for the first time since 1993 when the Blue Jays won their second straight World Series title. But things really came crashing down in the weeks that followed, as the Raptors then faced the music with Kawhi Leonard in his contract situation. The Raptors had taken a gamble by trading DeMar DeRozan to the San Antonio Spurs in order to acquire Kawhi Leonard, knowing he was going to be on a 1-year contract and he was likely going to be a rental player. But hey, the Raptors still ended up winning the NBA championship. That is a trade that they would make 101 times out of 100 if they could go back and do it again.
I'll make that deal. How about you, Ujiri? You make that deal?
I'd make that deal.
I don't blame you. Damn good deal.
But once you get that taste of victory, you want to go and get that again. The Raptors wanted to bring back Kawhi Leonard to defend their NBA championship, but Kawhi Leonard may have had other ideas and was willing to play the free agent market. The Los Angeles Lakers were a major player in the Kawhi sweepstakes, as were the Raptors and as, of course, were the Los Angeles Clippers. But what it ultimately came down to, seemingly with Kawhi Leonard, was he wanted to play with Paul George. At the time, Paul George was an MVP finalist. He came third in MVP voting and was regarded as likely the second best two-way player in the NBA behind only, well, Kawhi Leonard. This is where the Oklahoma City Thunder came into play into the Kawhi Leonard picture, because they were coming off of that first-round exit to the Portland Trail Blazers, the very famous series where Damian Lillard waved him off after Game 5 where he hit the series-winning shot over Paul George. But Kawhi was still hungry to play with Paul George, and there didn't see a ton of desire for Kawhi to be in Toronto to begin with, but perhaps he was willing to stay with the team if they were willing to go out and acquire Paul George. This is where the trade nearly came down for the Raptors, but the trade is so ridiculous that we should be thanking our lucky stars that this one never came to fruition, because the Oklahoma City Thunder, as a starting point for this Paul George trade, offered up Paul George and Russell Westbrook, who wasn't far off of winning an MVP himself, in exchange for Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, and 4 unprotected first-round picks from the Raptors. Masai Ujiri must have thought this one over a little bit, but ultimately, the Raptors felt like in this situation that they were being used as a ploy, as a smokescreen sort of thing, to get the Los Angeles Clippers more interested, because the notion from the Raptors was that, well, Kawhi Leonard wanted to be with the Clippers all along. But had the Raptors pulled the trigger on this sort of trade? After all, this is the starting point of the trade, what the Oklahoma City Thunder offered, and if nothing ever came down from the Clippers in this situation, Paul George and Russell Westbrook could have very well ended up on the Raptors for the 2019-2020 season. Ultimately, as we know, this is not exactly what played out, because Kawhi Leonard eventually went to the Los Angeles Clippers. It was a saga that took seemingly a couple of weeks. It went about a week into July before all things settled down here, and in a late night hour, Kawhi Leonard signed with the Clippers, and it was later revealed that the Clippers were also trading for Paul George. No, they did not get Russell Westbrook in this deal, but they got Paul George in exchange for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, 3 unprotected first-round picks from the Los Angeles Clippers, 2 unprotected first-round picks via the Miami Heat, and the rights to 2 different pick swaps. Yes, the Los Angeles Clippers gave the king's ransom in order to get Paul George, and it's a trade that to this day, it's a difficult one for maybe Clippers fans to see. It is a trade that really feels like it came out of a feeling of desperation. The Los Angeles Clippers, never having won an NBA championship in their entire franchise history, let alone get to an NBA Finals, let alone at that point get to a conference final. Since then, yes, they've gotten to a conference final. At that point, they had never even gone beyond the second round. So giving up that much for Paul George, it really feels like it's a trade that comes out of desperation. But knowing you also get the prize of Kawhi Leonard by acquiring Paul George, the Clippers were willing to pull the trigger. The Raptors were very much in a different scenario at this time. They were coming off of an NBA championship. They had a championship level roster, and much to the disagreement of many NBA fans out there, that was a championship level core with Kawhi Leonard, and it was pretty damn close to a championship level core without Kawhi Leonard. But he wanted to go to LA. He wanted to play with Paul George. That is why he ended up with the Clippers. This isn't a bashing on Kawhi Leonard for leaving. This is just the reality of how things played out. But let's go back to this hypothetical situation where the Raptors do end up making that trade. They do end up making that trade. They acquire Paul George, they acquire Russell Westbrook, and also they do get Kawhi Leonard in return for doing all of these things as well. That is pretty borderline a super team in the modern NBA and what the Raptors were looking to achieve for that 2019-2020 season. But once again, I go back to the fact that the Raptors, they were not in a desperate situation like the Los Angeles Clippers were. We were coming off of that NBA championship. If Kawhi Leonard had just returned, that would have been the exact same team that had just gone out and won an NBA championship. In fact, it likely would have been a better team with the young and ascending Pascal Siakam getting to All-Star and All-NBA level the very next season. Fred VanVleet would go on to eventually become an All-Star. That next season, Kyle Lowry was also an All-Star. So there was a huge amount of talent remaining on that team, and it was a championship level team, especially if Kawhi Leonard had just returned. And what we actually saw in the reality here is that the Raptors got to Game 7 of the second round without Kawhi Leonard on their team. The Clippers, having made that massive trade to get Paul George and Kawhi, well, they also lost in Game 7 of the second round. So it's clear to see the Raptors were still a talented team. They just couldn't get over the top without Kawhi Leonard there. That is completely fair to say. But what if they had made this trade? Because they still haven't gotten back to a conference final since they let Kawhi Leonard go to the Clippers rather than making this blockbuster trade for Paul George. Well, since Paul George came to the Los Angeles Clippers, I think it's pretty fair to say he hasn't quite gotten back to the levels that he displayed with the Thunder, where once again he was a finalist for MVP. Yes, he is one of the best players in the NBA. He's a perennial all-star, but hasn't quite gotten back to those top-tier levels, and we certainly haven't seen Paul George get to those top-tier levels in the biggest moments in the playoffs. Kawhi Leonard, when he's actually on the court playing and not out injured, we've seen him have some ridiculous games in the playoffs once again, but it just hasn't been enough for this Clippers team, who just really hasn't been able to put the right depth around their players. The best way to build up depth within your team, exactly what the Raptors did, the formula they used to win their championship, is building through the draft. Rookie contracts win championships because you need to supplement your superstar core with really good players who aren't getting paid very much because they are coming out of the draft. They're in their 4-year window after the draft where maybe they are ascending into star players, but they certainly aren't getting paid like it. With 5 first-round picks and 2 pick swaps being sent to the Thunder in order to get Paul George, also, by the way, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander being involved in that trade, the Clippers have never been able to put the right depth and the right pieces around that core to make it successful. If the Raptors are the ones to have made this trade, well, they would be in the same sort of predicament. In fact, they would be even worse off because they would be dealing with the hassle of the Russell Westbrook contract. Russell Westbrook signed a 5-year extension a year before this offseason happened, where he almost ended up in a Toronto Raptors uniform. The contract that he signed would have expired at the end of this current season. So we've seen the way Russell Westbrook's career, unfortunately, trend very much downwards. That is a contract that the Raptors would have had to have been dealing with this entire time. Maybe they could have offloaded at some point and not really gotten back a great return, but this is a situation that has developed, unfortunately, with Westbrook that the Raptors would have had to deal with, and it would have cost them 4 unprotected first-round picks from themselves. It would have costed Pascal Siakam, who has since gone on to make 2 All-NBA teams and make 2 different All-Star teams, and it would have also cost Fred VanVleet, who has also turned into an all-star point guard. Maybe looking at it, hey, you're getting Kawhi Leonard, you're getting Paul George, you're getting Russell Westbrook damn near his peak, and it's costing you Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, and 4 first-round picks. Maybe that does make a little bit of sense looking back on it, all the way back in 2019 as to what the Raptors could have achieved. But you have to also factor in that you had to pay Kawhi, you had to take on that George contract, you had to take on that massive Westbrook contract. Maybe what's happening with the Clippers right now is they don't have a proper point guard on their team, and that could have made the difference. The Raptors at the time, well, they still would have had Kyle Lowry. They still would have had, well, Danny Green probably would have returned. They still would have had Serge Ibaka, Marc Gasol, but Serge Ibaka made a lot of money. Marc Gasol made a lot of money. Kyle Lowry made a lot of money. So bringing back Kyle Lowry to that team, that would have been very difficult to do with all these extra contracts, keeping Marc Gasol, keeping Serge Ibaka. All of these constraints would have been put on the Raptors, who were coming off of an NBA championship. There was no rush. There was no desperation from the team to make a trade, to make a push, to go all in for a championship because they had just done it. That was a championship level team already. They just needed to have that last piece to put them over the top. That was supposed to be Kawhi Leonard. He did not want to do that. You know what? For a guy who never wanted to be in Toronto to begin with, he gave it his all for the city. He gave it all for the franchise, got them to the pinnacle of an NBA championship. Then he wanted to go back home to LA, whatever it is. No hard feelings on my end. But the Raptors in this situation, Paul George and Russell Westbrook nearly were Toronto Raptors players. But Masai Ujiri has never and did not want to act out of a position of desperation. The Los Angeles Clippers, even to this day, years after making the trade to get Paul George, to get Kawhi. And you know what? Today, they've even ended up with Russell Westbrook on their team. They still have not gotten to an NBA Finals. They still have not won an NBA championship. Even with all these players in free agency who want to join that team, even with Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Russ on their team, they still have not gotten to that point. So looking back in hindsight, we can safely say that the asking price was far too high. Even if the Raptors were just being used to leverage a bigger deal coming from the Clippers for the Thunder, even if that was the case, I think if the Raptors really wanted to make it happen, they could have been the team to acquire Paul George and also get Kawhi Leonard back. But that is not what materialized, and I thank my lucky stars every day that it didn't happen, because this sort of trade, it would have cost the Raptors their identity, it would have cost them picks, it would have damaged their future. Quite literally, this trade would have cost the Raptors everything. Looking back on this potential trade, do you think the Raptors made a mistake in not doing it and bringing Paul George, Russell Westbrook, and Kawhi Leonard to the team? Or do you think Masai Ujiri made the smart decision? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for Raptors content in videos, live streams, shorts, and more. Drop a like if you enjoyed, and we'll see you again next time for another video.